The Merchant of Venice is anti-Semitic because Shakespeare's anti-Semitic because Western civilization is
so wrong,
blah, right?
It's so wrong.
Whereas I always think, boy, I don't know. This, especially if you contrast it to portrayals of Jews elsewhere at the time.
Look at Marlowe's Barabbas.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Shylock is so much more sympathetic.
Was that play called the Jew of Venice?
The Jew of Malta.
That's the Jew of Malta.
Yeah.
So Shakespeare's written the Jew of Venice as an answer to the Jew of Malta.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's
because when The Merchant was released, its subtitle was The Jew of Venice.
So we're here today with two distinguished professors of the humanities. We have Patrick Gray, who's the Dean of Arts and Letters here at UATX, and Simon Haines, who is the founding CEO of the Ramsay Centre for Western Civilization. And we're going to have a discussion today about what is Western civilization, why is it distinctive, why do we choose to teach our students here explicitly what Western civilization is, the canon that it's produced. So I thought I might start by posing that question to you first, Simon. What is Western civilization, or what is distinctive about this thing that we're trying to teach here?
Thanks very much, Ben, and a great pleasure to join you, and wonderful to be at this terrific new university this week. Well, look, slightly tongue-in-cheek as a way of starting, I usually, for students, I have a kind of Monty Python burst that I give them at the beginning, where you remember the People's Revolutionary Front of Judea are trying to undermine the Roman Empire, and John Cleese is going through all these terrific revolutionary plans, but the audience keeps saying, yeah, but the Roman Empire is actually quite good. and eventually he gets really frustrated and he says, apart from sanitation, medicine, wine, public order, freshwater systems, roads, public health, and peace, what has the Roman Empire ever done for us? You remember this thing from the Life of Rome. So here's my little riff. Apart from antibiotics, antiseptics, disinfectants, nearly all modern medicine, eradication or reduction of all ancient endemic diseases, especially perinatal mortality, rule of law, equality before the law, historically unprecedented equality between the sexes, representative democracy, separation of powers, 3 or 4 industrial revolutions, electricity, gas, coal, wind, solar power technologies, worldwide transport and communication systems, the internet, religious tolerance, AI, separation of church and state, liberal individualism, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, open markets, vastly increased average prosperity, longevity, and standard of living across the whole world. What has Western civilization ever done for us? Which is all true. All not to be forgotten. But the risk you take, of course, is just sounding like a kind of West is best monologue, and that's the last thing I think we would ever want to do. So I usually tend to remind students at that point that the very word civilization itself is actually pre-Western. It's a Proto-Indo-European term. It looks like K-E-I, K. And the original root word, I mean, obviously it's kivis, etc., but long time before that, it actually meant a place to stay, like a stopping place, a resting place, or a place to call home. And it's the original distinction between nomadic movement and when you stop, when you actually make a settled place that is... And in that sense, there's dozens of civilizations, and the West is only one of them. So, I mean, that's... and I can go on and say what I think the kind of 4 pillars of the West are as well, but maybe Patrick wants to jump in.
I'm interested in... Well, I'll take a stab at maybe the pillars of the West. I don't know what you're going to say on that front, but I'm sitting here thinking as you're describing the achievements of the West and asking where did they come from, what was the unifying principle. And I tend to be uncomfortable with answers like Jared Diamond in Guns, Germs, and Steel, who wants to say it's all an accident of material circumstances.
Right.
It's simply the geographic fact that the West was in the West that allowed them to have such and such advances. I do think there are intellectual commitments that enabled the West to make the advances that you have described. I think one of them is what I would say in a brief way is the confidence in the West that there is a logos and that it is intelligible. And what I mean by that is that there is a structure to the world. There are intrinsic structures to things. Like when we talk about biology, we're talking about the structure of life, or geology, the structure of the earth. That there is such a structure out there to be discerned, and that we are intellectually capable of figuring it out. So it's not necessarily all mysterious and inscrutable. Reason has a role to play, and that doesn't preclude the existence of a God, but it, in the West, it is aligned with this idea that God voluntarily creates the world and maintains the world in such a way that we can grasp what's going on. Yeah. And this allows for and enables the scientific achievements that you described. The other, I suppose what I would think of as one of the pillars of the West, is the idea that each human being has a free will, and that this will is somehow in the image of God and is important and is to be respected.
Right.
And over the course of the history of the West, I think this belief in the dignity of each individual and the importance of persuading individuals rather than coercing them into obedience, this concept moves outward from sort of rich, educated men to sort of all men, to include women, to include the world more generally, and eventually becomes the idea that all human beings have something about them that is to be respected.
Intrinsic worth.
Intrinsic worth, yeah. And I think this concept underpins many of the social or political developments that you described that have made the West so distinctive, and that we now see emulated around the world. Things like representative democracy, for example.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So, Simon, your recounting of the Monty Python skit draws my attention to something I remember Douglas Murray saying recently. Murray is, I think, one of the best
terrific
articulators about what is unique about the West and why we ought to defend it. And he relayed this, the anecdote of a boy not realizing that vanilla is its own flavor. And so the point was, when you're seeing, what seems to be just plain, actually might have a richness and a texture and a color all of its own that is kind of sometimes taken for granted by, certainly I think we got to a point in education where we took it for granted. That's why we now are arguing that we ought to teach Western civilization, whereas maybe a century ago that would have been a sort of laughable thing to say almost. It's because we were just doing it. But why did we get to the point where we had to consciously come to an idea about Western civilization and start something like the Ramsay Centre, which is there to promote the study of the West? I wonder what you both might think of that.
Well, that's an interesting question. A very kind of pragmatic answer to your question is, how did the Ramsay Centre kind of get to the point of being started?
Right.
Was that Paul Ramsay, who was a wealthy Australian businessman who made his money in private healthcare, realised increasingly that particularly the younger people that were working for him didn't seem to know basic things about the origins of Australian democracy or democracy in general, or why the West was distinctive in so many different ways. And this is partly why he decided to leave this huge bequest to creating courses in Western civilization.
A multi-billion-dollar bequest.
Originally, yes, so, or at least it was over $1 billion, so that was where, very pragmatically, the Ramsay Centre came from. But so maybe a roundabout way of answering your question, or half answering your question, or picking up on what Patrick was saying before in terms of why the West is the way it is. I usually think in terms of 4 founding pillars. And I haven't forgotten your question, we'll come back to that. But they are because this is a university that teaches the great books, as the Ramsay Centre also does. The 4 founding pillars are the Iliad, the dialogues of Plato, and particularly the figure of Socrates, the figure of Pericles in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, and the things that Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount.
Interesting.
And so why is that? Well, the Iliad is not the story of the Trojan War, as you know. It's the story of the anger of Achilles, which is the first word in the poem. It's the anger of
Rage,
Achilles,
yeah.
the rage, the wrath, whatever. But by the end of the poem, what Achilles is able to do is not just kind of suppress his wrath, but transform it, redeem it into that amazing moment in book 10 or whatever, whichever one it is, 20, where he has Priam, the elderly king of Troy. And remember that the West is Greece and the other is Troy. And this is a poem being written by a Westerner, by a Greek, in a criticism of the West. It's very not triumphalist. By the end of the poem, Achilles' treatment of Priam is extremely generous and very kind. And what he's done is he's redeemed his anger. It's actually a poem of redemption. It's a turning around of that universal human wrath and rage and anger towards the other civilization, and it becomes something forgiving and redeeming of the self. It's an extraordinary place to start Western
And you see
literature.
a through line from this
that.
story into Christianity.
Absolutely. So that which is the fourth pillar, because in between you've got the story of Pericles saying at the funeral oration in Thucydides, this is the origin of democracy. The reason our government is called demokratia is because the administration is in the hands of the many, not the few. I mean, nobody had ever said that before, right? No, nobody's ever said it since as well. I mean, it's just so succinct. Yes, that's it. That's what it's about. And so that's Thucydides and Pericles, and it's why you have to read that book. You've got to read Thucydides.
Well, we do make you have to read the Iliad before you get to UATX as a student. It's mandatory.
So,
it's the pre-orientation.
These are the best places. And the third figure is Socrates, because of the pursuit of truth. And this goes back to the logos that you were talking about, and where Socrates comes to out of the pre-Socratics is about conceptualizing what exactly is it that those pre-Socratic semi-scientific, semi-philosophical figures were actually doing. It is about the logos. It's about defining what justice and truth and freedom actually are. And what happened to him? He was put to death by his own so-called democracy. And remember also that Thucydides' book is also a story about democracy failing. It's the failure of democracy and what you've got to watch out for and why you have to be careful. So it's a really important thing. And then there's Socrates put to death by his own people for speaking up for the truth and corrupting the minds of the young, like we all do in universities, right? And then the fourth one is what Jesus says so extraordinarily in the Sermon on the Mount, where he explicitly says, I know we all believe in the doctrine of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, basically a revenge doctrine to anticipate what we might say about the Merchant of Venice a bit later. It's a revenge story. But I say to you, forgive those that hurt you. You know, it's the turn the other cheek thing, which is, by all human standards before and since, a really weird thing to say. And yet it's been utterly kind of formative and foundational for our civilization. So I think of those as the four pillars.
So that's interesting. So we say that the four pillars of the West can literally be found
in books,
in the canon.
Absolutely.
That you learn at this university.
Exactly.
Dean Gray, maybe you want to expand a little bit upon what we teach here and why that might just by itself draw one.
Gee, I hope you teach all of them.
Yes, I was going to say you'll be happy to know that all of those pillars feature prominently in our intellectual foundations, which is what we call our core curriculum.
Fantastic. Right.
And I was thinking about what you were saying, and when the Ramsay Centre came out, there was much controversy about it being the Ramsay Centre for Western Civilization.
Right.
I always thought the most controversial part of it, sub rosa, was the Ramsay Centre for Western Civilization.
Yeah.
Because what I see in a lot of universities and schools is a sort of progressive desire to look away from the past, not to study the past, not to study the tradition of the civilization, but instead to sort of feed students what you might call dreams of utopia. And in many, many universities and many schools, there is a slow motion version of the Cultural Revolution. You may remember the Maoist cry during the Cultural Revolution, down with the old, out with the old, right? Get rid of the four olds, old culture, old books, all these old things. And so we have seen that in other institutions of education, and we have realized it is in fact very valuable for students to encounter civilization, to encounter the ideas that have come from the past and that can inoculate us against bad ideas in the present. We can weigh, when a politician is coming to us with a proposal, it really helps to be able to weigh it against something like the expedition in Thucydides that goes so poorly, and you can sort of think through, well, something like this has been tried before. Yeah. We then ask, well, if we are going to have the students study tradition and civilization, let's start with our own. Let's try to understand what's valuable about it. And I will say one of the distinctive features of Western civilization is this emphasis on forgiveness that you're describing. That is associated par excellence with Christianity, but I think it starts to emerge much sooner. So I think you're right that Homer's Iliad is a critique, a criticism of this kind of honor, shame, vengeance culture.
Absolutely.
Yeah? I think the same thing emerges in the later Roman epic, the Aeneid. You read the Aeneid and you learn all about the conquests of Rome, but you come away with it thinking, how many people had to suffer and die along the way? Is imperial power really worth the cost in human life? And I think this undercurrent of pity and mercy and forgiveness finally becomes explicit and finds a framework in Christianity, which then comes to sweep like wildfire all across the West. And I think in keeping with what you were saying about unconscious assumptions, nowadays, even when people who don't think of themselves as Christian criticize the West or criticize Christianity, they criticize it in Christian terms. They say, the problem with Christianity is that it's not forgiving enough, or that it's hypocritical. But that's not at all how, say, a pagan Roman would think. A pagan Roman would think, it's beneath contempt to care about the weak. Why do you want to preserve the lives of those who can't defend for themselves, right? And so, here I'm echoing a historian like Tom Holland, who's sort of saying, look, Christianity is like the water that we swim in, even if we don't realize it. And here I'm disagreeing with Nietzsche. Nietzsche, to his credit, understands this sea change in assumptions about ethics. He, of course, thinks it's terrible. He wants us to go back to this older model of kind of barbaric exaltation and cruelty and strength and so on. And I disagree. It's useful to know about Nietzsche and to understand.
Yes.
But he is in a way against the grain of this very precious element of Western civilization that I would want to put alongside the others as a reason to preserve and cultivate Western civ.
And I think something else kind of on another level, Patrick, that you're pointing to, people forget this about the West, is that it, to my knowledge, more than any other civilization, it's built on values clashes, oppositions of value. And you've mentioned, in a sense, what you're talking about is the opposition between Judeo-Christian values and classical values. It's the old Jerusalem versus Athens story about the foundation of the West, which is so deep and is implicit in a way even in what Jesus says, and that's another level of values clash between Judeo values and Christian values.
Yes, for sure.
So that's one level.
So you're saying there's a dialectic embedded in the operating system.
At every stage,
Western
exactly. That's very nicely put. At every stage, there's a values clash. So far from being a kind of monolithic or progressive. I think this is all in. This is Isaiah Berlin, who talks a lot about incommensurable values. The West is built on a series of incommensurabilities, which makes it it has the kind of resilience that a hybrid has, if that makes sense.
So you're
going to disagree.
I'm going to disagree with you a little bit. So I would say the West. I would see the West a bit more like the history of the Church in opposition to heresies. So I would say there is a core distinctiveness to the West that has to do with these ideas about the capacities of human reason, the importance of forgiveness. that emerge more distinctively over time, and along the way, dissidents emerge who disagree with this. And that dissidence, like heresy in the history of theology, prompts clearer articulation of what it is we value. Now, I'm also going to agree with you, though, and say that because Western culture has this confidence in the capacity of reason, Western culture is more comfortable than others with accommodating this kind of debate and saying we are going to allow the heretics, the kind of the Nietzsches, for example, to be within this culture and to articulate their opposition to some of our most fundamental, value assumptions. But I would see a sort of main line. Another example of this would be.
So to you, the heresies are not themselves essential values, but they may be essential in prompting us to examine what the values are. If we're trying to square your position. With Simon's,
exactly. So I would kind of see not an equal dialectic, but like a main branch, and then voices dissenting from it. That in a way, there's a sense in which a heretic is almost like a grain of sand in an oyster that prompts the oyster to develop a pearl because
it's a lovely image. I'm still a little bit worried, though. I mean, there is something fundamentally incommensurable between the idea that you repay an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and the idea that you turn the other cheek and forgive those that hurt you.
Yeah, and
so how is that a grain of sand?
Well, can you live exclusively? Well, can you live one of two ways and have what we have, or is the West dependent upon that polarity and finding the way between them?
Constantly going backwards and forwards between the two ends.
I would say, so I suppose we started out by just asking what is distinctive about the West. And so I see certain ideas as distinctive to the West, or at least distinctively central within Western thought. So, for example, I think the idea of forgiving your enemies, very unusual.
In world history terms, unique, right?
Yeah. And so this is a distinctively sort of Western, if not innovation, at least emphasis.
Totally. Yeah.
And I think the West allows people to disagree with that, but I would see it as distinctively central to our tradition. Another example would be something, so, Nietzsche is uncomfortable with it, but that doesn't mean that he has equal weight with this force within our tradition. Another example would be something like postmodernism, someone like Foucault, who is questioning...
Is there anyone like Foucault?
Well, there are a lot of people who try to be, let's put it that way. Someone who's questioning the very fundamental idea that there is a logos, that there is anything out there to be grasped by our reason. The West will tolerate this, and that opposition, like a gadfly, will sort of prompt us to articulate more clearly what it is that we believe. But Foucault is not equally central to the tradition as, say, Socrates.
Sure.
He represents an oppositional force to this main line of Western thought, which holds that there is something out there, some sort of structure in the world that we can discern through dialectic. And maybe it's precisely that honor that we give to dialectic, that faith in the capacity of human reason, that gives us the courage to allow for this kind of internal dissidence.
Well, I think we have to remember that, and because Foucault's way of thinking almost took over the academy in many respects in the last 50 or 60 years. So those of us that don't agree need to push back.
Yes.
But can I just add something else, Ben? And I know you've got to move on.
No.
But just thinking about this clash of values thing, there's a wonderful book that we've talked about by a French historian of philosophy, historian of ideas, basically, called Remy Brague, B-R-A-G-U-E. You know this thing.
Yeah.
And I think the title of the book in French is La Voie Romaine, the Roman way. And in English it's called Eccentric Cultures, A Theory of the West, or something like that. And I'm going to this because I'm thinking about clashes of value versus your idea of a consistent line of thought with dissidents and heretics chipping at it all the way along the line, right? So what Brague says is that what is distinctive about the West, it's kind of nice. He says, really, it's humility. the West is intrinsically a humble civilization. Okay, why is that? Because nowadays everybody talks about triumphalism. So where's he coming from? And so he says Rome is the key. Mm-hmm. And Rome is the key because it's the junction point of Athens and Jerusalem. And Rome thinks of itself as a secondary civilization in both respects. It inherits the Christian tradition from Jerusalem, but it inherits the Greek tradition from Athens, but sees itself as responsible for uniting the two and transmitting them. So the stream that you're talking about kind of comes forth out of Rome, whereas two divergent strands had come in. It, as a secondary civilization, transmits them on. And he says, therefore, the West thinks of itself as transmissive, not transgressive, transmissive. And I think this is really great for educators, because if we're thinking of foundational learning courses, great books courses, they are transmissive. We're basically passing on this dual or whatever it is inheritance. So I just think that's and it's also interesting in the context of comparative civilizations, because he's actually a major world expert on Islamic civilization too, as you know, and he sees this as a huge difference between the West and Islamic civilization, namely that Islam is not transmissive, it's not secondary, it's originary, it's foundational. You always go back to the Quran. Everything comes out of the Quran, whereas the West essentially thinks of itself as coming from somewhere else and transmitting it. I think that's a great thesis, and it's an interesting way of comparing the two civilizations as well. In a way, he's also saying, I mean, this chimes with what you were just saying, Patrick, that Islam doesn't have the tradition of constant chipping away or heresy, in a sense that Islam doesn't have that in the way the West does. I don't know if that makes sense.
Is Islam, do we think, maybe I'll ask this question, is Islam an analog for the Eastern civilizations, let's say that very
Middle Eastern,
it propagates in the same way that Christianity is an analog for Western civilization, or are we on different?
You'd be leaving out China,
right?
So that's the only problem. But Middle Eastern certainly, right. yeah.
Or is the relationship between, say, the master theological idea, master religious idea of each of those civilizations, are we talking about a different set of relationships?
I think Islam is in a unique position of being more similar to the West than, say, South Asia or East Asia.
Sure.
But also very different in other ways. So, and maybe I can illustrate this by coming back to what you said of the West as uniquely humble, which may sound odd to say, because we've been like kind of bragging about how great the West is, right? So are we?
And isn't Buddhism so humble and so on?
Yeah. But I can maybe approach that claim from a different direction, which is that democracy is very rare in Muslim majority countries.
Right.
This problem was brought home to me with particular force about 10 years ago when I was teaching at West Point during the Arab Spring.
Oh, yeah.
And I was asked to teach a course on the history and culture of Egypt during the 20th century. So we read a lot of novels by Naguib Mahfouz and watched films and read about the origins of the Muslim Brotherhood and so on. And my takeaway is that the politics of a civilization resemble its theology. So there's a sense in which
theology is upstream of
theology is upstream. So there's a sense in which polytheism translates to a kind of democracy or aristocracy, at least. What you get in Islam is a vision of God as wholly transcendent, inscrutable, all-determining, to be obeyed without question. And I think this vision of God then plays out in their politics, where men within their households, with their family, rulers within their country, feel like this is the model of leadership. And it is, to my mind, a rather toxic model. And the Christian model, by contrast, is one where God voluntarily comes to earth, humbles himself, he washes people's feet, he suffers on the cross,
Sure.
And that this model of delegated authority, bracketing for one moment whether Christianity is true or not, this model of authority
As an imaginative metaphor that gets into the intellectual bloodstream.
and it is very healthy. And I think we can see this partly from the times that Western culture or Christian culture has deviated from this. So if you look at Calvinism, for example, there's a sense in which the God of Calvinism is very similar to the God of, say, Sunni Islam, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And Calvinism taken seriously gets pretty scary. If you think about Calvin's Geneva, Cromwell's England,
Rousseau is a scary guy.
American Puritans, witch hunts and so on. And so, if your concept of the divine is off, then your civilization will be off. And so I think there's a sense in which the theology that is formulated through Christianity has very beneficial political knock-on effects that we have come to associate with the West in general.
So let's maybe pivot a little bit. I know when we sat down, we thought initially we might talk about Shakespeare having two great Shakespeare.
We've only got 1 hour.
The West is a great place to start if we're going to talk about Shakespeare. So we have talked about the canon, Homer, Socrates, Thucydides, Jesus. Shakespeare is not the only conspicuous author that comes in the Western canon after that, but he might be the most conspicuous that comes.
Maybe Dante,
after that. And then we have Jerusalem, Athens, Rome. But let's go to Venice, and let's talk about the two plays, The Merchant of Venice and Othello, maybe as a way of reflecting on what do you see Shakespeare doing insofar as he's a critic or a advocate of the West? Maybe Simon.
I'll just go quickly. I'm sure Patrick's got lots to say about this. That's a good question. Partly because you've picked very shrewdly, Ben. You've picked two plays that really play into conversations about where the West stands in relation to other civilizations, particularly the Judaic civilization and the Islamic one. I mean, people think of Othello. I just want to tell you, but we can't put pictures up on the screen. I wish I could.
We might be able to cut some in.
We'll cut them in later. But there's a fabulous portrait of Shakespeare called the Chandos portrait, which is in the National Portrait Gallery in London. You must know this well. And unlike the one that everybody knows, the one where he's got this huge forehead that goes, which is an engraving, the Droshout engraving. That's the picture everybody tends to have. But the Chandos probably has as much authenticity and claim to be actually what he was like as the one that we all know. And if you look at it, he's very swarthy. He's got curly, almost ringlets, and he's got a ring in his ear. And this portrait was kind of dismissed by elderly, white, Victorian, straight-laced critics. And they actually said things like, no, he looks far too Jewish. Can't possibly be authentic. And that always just makes me laugh, because why should we think of Shakespeare as kind of, looking like you do or I do, or why does he just have to look like a kind of regular white guy, whatever that would be like? And then if you put that alongside, talking about Othello now, if you think about that, there's a wonderful painting, and I think it's in London. You can Google this, and the painting is of a gentleman by the name of, and I've had to write this down, Abd el-Wahid ben Mesaoud ben Mohammed Anoun. Now this guy. This guy was the ambassador from the Barbary court to the court of Queen Elizabeth I, about 2 to 4 years after The Merchant of Venice was written and just before Othello. So, and he's an amazing-looking guy. And the critical thing is that he's the Barbary, the North African, Arab, probably Islamic ambassador to the court of Queen Elizabeth. And this is probably the picture Shakespeare had in his mind of Othello as the Moor of Venice, which is kind of an Islamic point that we're making here. And he's very distinguished and terrific looking, this Muhammad Anoun. So it's good to think that the story isn't as simple as you might. Shakespeare probably met him, probably saw him at the court, and he looks gorgeous and very civilized. And then you think, well, what about Othello? Othello is probably not a central or a Central African black man. He's probably a North African Moor. So you sort of, this goes to what you were teaching. So it's always a little bit more problematic than you think. So there's that with Othello, and then Desdemona says things like, "I saw Othello's visage in his mind." It's such a beautiful line. She doesn't see whether he's black or Arab. She sees his face in what he thinks. It's Martin Luther King. She's more interested in the quality of his character than in the colour of his skin. It's just classic. And you know, there's a lot of speeches where Othello gives the reasons why he fell in love with Desdemona and she fell in love with him. I loved her that she did pity me. It's her feelings for him it's reciprocated, and it is not racist. The only really racist thing that's said in Othello is Iago. An old black ram is tupping your white ewe, you know, and Iago is a horrible guy. So we instantly kind of don't associate with him. We don't admire him at all. So it's almost an anti-racist play rather than the racist one it's sometimes presented as. And I can go on about
so Shakespeare was ahead of Ibram X. Kendi. Not enough to be not racist.
Way ahead. He transcends that kind of thinking completely. And I can bang on about the Merchant of Venice as well. But
Dean Gray, please.
Yeah. So Othello. I mean, unfortunately, there is scholarship out there. I use the term scholarship somewhat loosely, which would say, you know. Shakespeare, you know, Othello, the play is racist. Shakespeare is racist, and he is a representative of how the entirety of Western civilization is racist.
Absolutely.
And this is and students should not be reading this because it's going to give them bad racist ideas in their mind, and instead should be reading other things. All of this, I think, is horribly simplistic. For many of the reasons that you've outlined. I mean. Shakespeare goes out of his way to portray Othello as a very admirable character. Oh. And in The Merchant of Venice, too, you remember the Moorish suitor who comes to try to win the ladies, you know, and
impressive.
And he comes across as a catch, and we sort of think, well, why is she passing this guy up?
And she says nothing whatever to suggest that the reason she might be passing him up is anything to do with that.
I think Shakespeare accurately captures that there are racist people within Western civilization in a character such as Iago, but he's hardly the most savory character in the play, you know, like, and I think here it's instructive to compare Shakespeare to other playwrights writing at the time, right? In other Renaissance English plays, you get the Turk as this sort of monster, right?
Absolutely.
But Othello is very sympathetic. And we see him converted into being a monster by the influence of this other white Venetian, Iago. I think where Shakespeare is criticizing racism as something that's artificial, that's introduced, that is actually a lie, that is damaging to this person. I think where Shakespeare does have a more substantive criticism has to do with Islam. And where we see that Othello's response to his jealousy, Othello is notionally a converted Christian.
Yes.
But when push comes to shove and he faces the choice of either killing Desdemona or forgiving her, he can't quite get his mind around it. And finally he comes to thinking, well, I have to kill her lest she seduce more men. So he finds this weird way of thinking, somehow I'm doing a favor to other people by doing this. And so we see how his sort of warlike, heritage or Moorishness or something is leading him to misunderstand some of the central messages of Christianity. And here I think we might recognize that Shakespeare is using Othello in part as a criticism of tendencies within his own culture. Shakespeare shows us plenty of hyper-martial, warlike, aggressive young men who are coming out of his own Christian English culture. In fact, there's an argument that Othello is a way to defamiliarize the problems with the English aristocracy. In much the same way, I read a very interesting essay by Emma Smith where she says, there's an argument that Shylock as a Jew is a way to defamiliarize the extra strict, unforgiving Calvinist immigrant from France. Because the problem that you had in England at this time was not, there were very few Jews in England, but you did have a lot of Puritans and you did have a lot of Calvinist refugees coming in. And we do see Shakespeare sort of making fun of Calvinists elsewhere, for example, Malvolio or Angelo and so on. So sometimes we think what we may think Shakespeare is up to in this play, his concerns may be slightly elsewhere.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And we should go to The Merchant as well. But I'm thinking on Othello, Patrick, that so what Desdemona does in loving him is kind of, I saw Othello's visage in his mind. She sees the best in him. She brings out the best in him. And she almost succeeds in making him the kind of person that we would wish him to be. But meanwhile, there's Iago, constantly chipping away at what she's trying to do and almost forcing him to revert to something deeper in his own personality. So he would have got there if it hadn't been for Iago, who's white and a horrible guy, pulling him in the other direction.
Yeah.
So that's fascinating. So Merchant?
Merchant. I mean, Merchant of Venice is an interesting play for all kinds of reasons. One is the people. You get a similar line of thought. The Merchant of Venice is anti-Semitic because Shakespeare's anti-Semitic because Western civilization is
so wrong.
Blah, right?
It's so wrong.
Whereas I always think, boy, I don't know. This, especially if you contrast it to portrayals of Jews elsewhere at the time.
Look at Marlowe's Barabbas.
Yes,
exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Shylock is so much more sympathetic.
Was that play called the Jew of Venice?
The Jew of Malta.
That's the Jew of Malta.
Yeah.
So Shakespeare's written the Jew of Venice as an answer to the Jew of Malta.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's
because when The Merchant was released, its subtitle was The Jew of Venice.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
There's a line in The Merchant of Venice.
Not its subtitle, the way it was billed in the playbills that went out.
Yeah. There's a moment in The Merchant of Venice which has fascinated me, which is when Portia comes in disguise as the judge.
Balthazar.
Yeah, and we have Antonio and we have Shylock.
Yeah.
And she says, which is the merchant and which is the Jew, right? Now, this is often played for laughs because often in productions he's dressed in very traditional Jewish garb. Yeah. But I think there's an interesting possibility that they could be dressed similarly. And she could say this in a spirit of, I really don't know which is which, because Shakespeare's interested in their underlying humanity. There's a sense in which Antonio and Shylock, they're mere images of each other,
Absolutely. Underlying humanity. Hath not a Jew eyes, hath not a Jew hands, organs? If you prick us, do we not bleed? And if you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not seek revenge?
Yeah. I mean, this is very far from Barabbas. I mean, Barabbas is like a cartoon villain. He's like, how am I going to, torture people, So, Shylock is not quite like that.
And in a way, that marvelous speech by Shylock it just echoes. Now, he's called Terence. You know more about Roman poetry than I do. The comedy dramatist Terence, who wrote that wonderful line about nothing human is alien to me. Nihil humani alienum me puto, whatever it goes.
Yeah.
And it's what Shylock's saying. It's exactly what he's saying. I'm human. And Terence was a Berber.
Oh, interesting.
He was a Berber. He was from North Africa. He was from Carthage, which was not only an Ottoman North African civilization, but a defeated and enslaved civilization. And he still said that. And remember that Shylock says, remember that point in the trial scene, he says, you spit on me. And but he says, you have slaves. You guys have slaves. You remember that speech?
Yes. Yeah.
You have slaves. I mean, the Western Christians are not great people in this play.
Yeah, so we see that Antonio is no more forgiving of Shylock than essentially
Antonio is horrible to Shylock
is of him.
He almost takes his revenge on Shylock instead of the revenge Shylock failed to take on him.
Yeah, so I think Shakespeare is alive to the possibility of hypocrisy within Christian culture.
Yeah. Absolutely right.
At the same time as he is articulating the ideals of Christian culture. And so I think in that play, Shakespeare on the one hand wants that beautiful speech about the quality of mercy.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, yes.
I think Shakespeare on the one hand wants to argue that the forgiveness that is foregrounded
Yeah.
in Christian ethics really is superior to revenge.
Yeah.
At the same time, that doesn't mean individual Christians are necessarily any morally superior to individual Jews.
I think that's a very good way of looking at it. And here's a little point of etymology that it amazes me that nobody makes more of this, or maybe they have and I just don't know. But that's the most famous line in the play, right? The quality of mercy is not strained. So mercy is kind of the theme, kind of the symbolic theme of the play.
Yeah.
The title of the play is The Merchant of Venice. And nobody ever remembers that the word merchant and the word mercy are cognates. They come from the same derivation. They come from the Latin word merces, which is like a market.
Oh, interesting.
Because remember, there was a market for mercy in the medieval and Renaissance. A mercy was you paid the priest to ask on your behalf that God would have mercy on you. So mercy is actually, in some ways, mercy is a fundamentally quite mercenary concept, the same word again. Right. And Portia uses the word mercenary at the end of the play also. So that the idea of mercy as we think of it, meaning pity, and the idea of mercantilism and merchant are all kind of all implicated with each other in the play. He's muddling them up together. It's really fascinating the way that he does that. And mercy is such a complicated term. You know, there was this Renaissance word misericord, which was substitutable for mercy. That you used it instead. People used it to mean mercy, and misericord means sad heart, miser, and then cordium. So sad mercy means sad. So the quality of mercy is sadness. There's something deeply sad about. And Antonio's first lines in the whole play, "In sooth, I know not why I am so sad." And in a way, the whole play is about the sadness of Antonio and what is he sad about? And does the sadness generate a kind of vindictive spitefulness almost, which he then takes out on Shylock? So that's my line. That's my line on the play.
I have a thought about this because very near the beginning of the play, Graciano, the kind of comic character, is making fun of Antonio for being so somber and sad,
melancholy. Yes. Yeah.
And and Graciano basically says, "I think you're putting on airs. You're acting so somber and sad because you want people to think that you're superior." And so a part of me has often wondered if Antonio represents something like Stoicism. There's a sense in which the indifference of the Stoic can superficially resemble the forgiveness of the Christian.
Right.
You know, like, there's a famous story that a man mistook Cato the Younger, the famous Roman Stoic, for someone else and came up and smacked him in the bathhouse and so on. And Cato ignored it.
Right.
And the guy came up later. It's like, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize it was you, Cato, the great politician." And Cato basically said nothing happened. But the whole motivation was one of sort of, "You're beneath my contempt."
Yeah, that's
right?
interesting. Yeah.
But whereas when a Christian is talking about turning the other cheek, then that's a deeper thing. That's mercy. That's forgiveness, right? And so I think what we see in Antonio is the failure of Stoicism, the moral failure of Stoicism that can look so similar to Christianity but not be the same. And actually you could...
So the classical and the Christian.
Yeah, you can see something like this with Othello too. You know, we think about Othello as a failed husband, a failed Christian possibly, but he's also a failed Stoic. At the very beginning of the play, all these people are like, "Are you sure you want to take your wife with you basically to the battlefront?" Right?
Yes. And he says, "It'll be fine, it'll be fine."
It'll be fine. He says, the young affects in me are defunct. Basically, I'm not prone to young passions anymore. Right. He says, "If my wife turns my head while I'm fighting, let all the local housewives take my helmet and turn it into a frying pan." Right? He sort of just dismisses it. So then afterward, at the end of the play, you know, the emissary from Venice is seeing how deranged Othello is acting and says, you know, "Is this the noble Moor whom our Senate calls all in all sufficient, the man whom passion could not shake?" And so I think with Antonio and with Othello, Shakespeare's trying to show us this other a Roman strain or classical strain in Western civilization of a morality founded on an idea of self-sufficiency that is actually cracks under pressure, or at least has a much colder and less
I think that's very
cast.
good, and to me that really resonates with Antonio particularly. I mean, people don't often remember that Montaigne, who Shakespeare read quite carefully and probably in French, his second essay, so you wouldn't have had to read very far into the Pensée to get to this. His second essay is called Of Sadness, de la Tristesse. And Antonio is the sad guy. And I think the kind of thinking that Montaigne is doing about sadness in that essay is exactly what Shakespeare is doing, including in Graziano. So you reference the thing, fish not with this melancholy bait for this full gudgeon, this opinion. That's what Graziano says to Antonio.
Yeah.
Well, Montaigne almost word for word says the same thing. There's a lot of people around who affect melancholy. Oh, I am so sad. That kind of feel sorry for me. It makes me important. I'm kind of subtle. I'm kind of deep. I'm so sad. And Montaigne is right on that, and he's just said that's fake. But he said sadness. You got to watch out for sadness, and he uses the Italian word tristezza as well as the French word tristesse, which apparently then, although this is no longer true in Italian now, but it was then, tristezza meant not just sadness, but kind of melancholy spitefulness. Kind of spleen, kind of splenetic thing, almost a bitter thing. And Montaigne says this. He says that's what tristesse, and he says that's what melancholy is. This is before the Anatomy of Melancholy was written. That came along 40 years later. So interesting. So Antonio's kind of the diagnosis is that kind of fundamental existential sadness that you talked about, which you're saying is a failure to be stoic, is also kind of a deeper moral failure to kind of get over this bitterness that comes with being a merchant. Is that theirs too somehow?
I suppose
the money thing.
I suppose what I'm thinking about is this connection to Montaigne is very interesting, because I think both Montaigne and Shakespeare associate this kind of melancholy or this kind of spiteful sadness with philosophy.
Yes.
They see this is the failing of the cynic, the stoic. Yeah. So there's
the Rodin thinker.
Yeah. There's a sense in which classical philosophy is to be respected, but classical philosophy falls short somehow in that the type of temperament or character that emerges from classical philosophy in the absence of Christianity is this kind of melancholy spitefulness.
Yes.
This is a fascinating discussion. Anyway, it's reading week this week. I wish we had some students here to watch these two English professors.
Before you take us away, I just want to say Portia is sad too. My little body is aweary of this great world, and the night methinks is but the daylight sick. She says that, right? So there's a sickness in the fabric of the society. Anyway, there's so much more we could talk about.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about
move us on.
Let's talk about teaching Shakespeare today. You're both eminent scholars and both great teachers of literature, but you're also both reformers. And if we're talking about the English-speaking world, the two institutions which we representing in a way here today, the Ramsay Centre, which you helped found, Simon, and UATX, where we are today, Patrick. I think we were addressing the same, and I've had a little to do with both, which has been a great privilege. But if both institutions are addressing maybe fundamentally the same thing that's going wrong in the English-speaking world, maybe more than the English-speaking world, but this is what we're dealing with. The Ramsay Centre decided to reform from within. And we have problems of, if we're taking Shakespeare, for example, not enough people are actually learning Shakespeare, and the ones that are maybe not being taught it in an ideal way. Ramsay Centre chose to reform from within by going through the existing institutions,
inserting courses into
the University of Austin. When our founders got together to address the same problems, one of them, which I think you mentioned before, Simon, of not being able to trust people who would come out of these existing legacy institutions and go into the workplace. So you have competency problems, but you have fundamentally problems of scholarship and problems of teaching. UATX decided that we needed to start something new, that reforming from within maybe was necessary, but it wasn't what we chose to do. So maybe we could have a reflection on what the challenges have been to higher education reform in the West. What are some of the lessons learnt either by reforming from within or in starting a new institution? Maybe, Patrick, we could reflect on what we've seen from our own students here, as opposed to what they might otherwise expect going into your stock standard university experience.
Oh, I mean, the students here are extraordinary. We get many students.
I was staggered when I saw that class. They're amazing.
Yeah, they're very smart and they're very independent. Many of them are products of alternative forms of K through 12 schooling. So we get students who are, they're coming out. Some of them are homeschooled. Some of them are coming from classical or Christian or Jewish schools or independent schools of one kind or another. And I think as school choice expands here in Texas very recently, and I think more so throughout the United States, we'll see more young people who want their university education to be more like their K through 12 education. Returning to the authors of the great books, substantive, no longer politicized, certainly not a kind of training ground for progressive activism and so on. I think students are looking for an alternative to what they see out there elsewhere in the mainstream institutions. And that's a bit easier in a way for us here in the United States, given a culture here of kind of independence, entrepreneurship, and especially a culture of giving. We have donors who have been very generous with us, and who are interested in founding universities, or founding this university, in shaping curricula, shaping the future of young people. In England, where I was for the better part of the past 10 years, and in Australia, my sense is that there is more of a default to the state somehow.
Absolutely.
It's more unusual for someone like Ramsay to come through and say, I'm going to take this $1 billion and I am going to intervene in higher education.
Pretty much unique. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
You also have a culture. I mean, Americans start new things to conserve what is good.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, that is the whole idea of the American Revolution, right? It's not just reinventing the world in the sense that the French Revolution maybe sought to do,
right?
But recognize something that was true, recognize that something was good, and they have revolutions in order to save what's good. The rest of the English-speaking world is not quite as bold, would it be fair to say?
It would be. I mean, I'm not a historian, but I think what Patrick is saying, what you're saying is absolutely right. I mean, from an Australian perspective, we look at the picture in America kind of enviously. It's partly just that the country is so much bigger and there are so many more options, so many more possibilities, but the entrepreneurial spirit is something that staggers me whenever I come here. And I'm not trying to bag my own country, but we don't have that attitude in the same way. It's partly the DNA of the country, the way it was founded. You talked about the founding fathers in America. The foundation of Australia is a very different story. Right. But what you notice, kind of the rock face confronting you when you try and achieve reform in the university sector in Australia, which we only are doing in a small way in Ramsay, just by inserting these great books programs into 3 of the 40 universities in Australia. What you notice is how, relative to the population, how huge and monolithic the sector is. Whereas you've got a story of diversity in the United States. Relative to the size and population of Australia, our tertiary sector is even bigger. I mean, I've jotted some numbers down, but something like there's something close to 1.5 million students studying in Australian universities. Now, I don't know how. So think of Australia as the size of Texas in terms of the population, but the size of the continental US in terms of area, so very thinly spread, but 1.5 million. So that's out of a population of 25 million. That's a huge percentage of the total people in Australia who are actually in universities. And some of these universities are huge. I mean, Monash, I think, is the biggest one. It has 80,000 students.
Yes.
That would presumably be even bigger than University of Texas in Texas.
Yeah, I mean, your large state universities here might get to 40, 50,000.
But in Australia, that's the model.
Yeah.
So all of them are big, except the sort of the outliers.
Yeah.
So what you're looking at is a kind of huge monolith. All of them are very big, very bureaucratic. Again, I don't know what the figures are here, but more than half of all people who work for universities in Australia are administrators, not teachers. So it basically.
Well, we have the same problem here. I mean, I think Harvard has roughly 7,000 undergraduates and roughly 7,000 administrators.
Okay,
I mean, not everybody's that bad, but that is an issue.
So that's one thing. Another thing is, because of the way Australia was first colonised and federated, we had five very widely spread states with huge distances in between them. And so every capital city had to have its own university, and they were all founded on exactly the same principles, and they're all exactly the same. So basically, I'll call it a monoversity. They're all carbon copies of each other. So there's no sense that diversity or kind of innovation would be a good thing. Right from the start, everything had to be the same as everything else. And the other thing that happened kind of more like 40 years ago rather than back at the beginning was a massive expansion, tripling, quadrupling of the numbers of the size of the universities and of the numbers of students, but also the emphasis on research. So everybody had to become a research university, no matter what you actually meant by research. So what you have, my summary is that we've got huge professional training institutions, because every state had to produce its own lawyers and doctors and architects and what have you. It was too far to travel from one to the other. So they all had to be the same. They all had to be professional training institutions, and then post-Dawkins, post-87, they all had to have research training institutions as well. And teaching just becomes a kind of little appendage that hangs off the edge of that. So you have massive professional training things with instruction. It's not teaching. It's not the same as education. And then all the prestige is in the research side. And then if you're lucky, somebody gets to think about teaching a little bit at the edges. So it's disincentivized like you wouldn't believe.
We've talked about this before, the Dawkins reforms, that there was a set of...
Late
Dawkins
80s.
was a treasurer in the Australian government. and
education minister.
And education minister. And instituted these reforms, which essentially really took the incentive away from the craft of teaching.
Absolutely.
But something in the American Academy, at least, has been somewhat resilient
like
to maintaining the craft of teaching. I mean,
Right.
we've attracted, maybe you might want to reflect on this, Dean Gray, we've attracted professors coming to this institution. Yes, of course, they're great researchers, but they have, A, a love of teaching, and B, they actually have had something of an opportunity to practice it well elsewhere, and to hone that craft, and to be able to come here and run a great seminar. And I often say to the students here, I say that to me as a now living as an American working at a university, I say the great thing as an outsider that strikes me about American higher education is maybe not that it created, Apollo or the Manhattan Project. It's the quality of the liberal arts seminar, which is absolutely sacred.
No, I think
in this country, at least. Do you want to have
please.
chime in on that?
Yeah. You're talking about how Australia was founded, and so part of this is how America was founded. Part of the founding was that all the religious zealots fled England to come here full of missionary enthusiasm, right? And so there are good and bad effects of that. A good effect of that is that it sometimes gets translated into teaching. And what once upon a time might have been a preacher or becomes a teacher, and they bring that sort of vocational commitment to Plato or Homer or Jane Austen or what have you, right? Which is great for
Bloom would say that the care for the souls of the young
is
is something that maybe originates from a literal missionary.
Yes, exactly.
Zeal. Yeah.
Now, I
The
think
only one who could ever reach me was the son of a teacher man.
yeah.
Whoa, Patrick! My jokes never had that kind of impact before. Boy,
All right.
are you okay?
I'm good. Oh no, I had a point I was going to make actually.
Simon, what was your question?
Oh no, so you were talking about why is the liberal arts so good in America?
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
Son of a preacher man.
Yeah, son of a preacher, because it's sort of like,
Sorry,
you
teacher man.
stunned me so much, I got collapsed. I'm sorry.
Oh dear.
So the good side is, people bring in this kind of like pastoral care, the kind of Protestant energy that goes into preaching. There's a sense in which that gets channeled into literary criticism, close reading of philosophy and English literature and so on. The dark side of that legacy is wokeism. There's a very interesting theory that part of the grip that kind of oppressor-oppressed dynamics and the whole sort of social justice line has on the American imaginary is its resemblance to Calvinism. There are the elect and the reprobates, and this kind of missionary Puritan zeal can be reconfigured in a noxious vein as what we would now call wokeism or social justice or so on. And that has unfortunately ideologically captured most of the humanities departments in the United States. So now we have a situation where, the professors are bringing this zeal, but they're bringing it for this activist purpose. And so the question is,
Yes.
how do you break up this partisanship, right? And I wonder if England and or the UK more generally and Australia might learn here from the example of the schools of civic thought that are emerging at public flagship universities all across the US, because we have
These are being put into public state-funded
public state universities, so
which all Australian universities are pretty much.
yes, exactly. The closest analog we have of Australian universities would be places like University of Florida, University of North Carolina, UT Austin, et cetera, right? Big public flagship campuses where, people in the state have a lot of loyalty to this university.
Right.
When I was growing up in North Carolina, it was like, well, of course I'm going to go to the University of North Carolina. Why I'm not even going to apply.
Okay, that's like Australia.
That's like Australia, right? Now here in the University of Austin, we're privately funded. We can be very nimble. We can be very quick. There are disadvantages to being in that big public university setting, but they're big. They're an analog for England, for Australia. And the move that can be made is for legislators to say that these universities need to include a school or a subdivision of that university that provides courses and faculty and programs that are not progressive. Right. Courses and faculty and programs that are at least centrist, maybe even occasionally conservative. So essentially, state-enforced ideological diversity.
This would be, sorry to interrupt you, Patrick. So this is red states.
This is red states. Okay. Well, kind of. I mean, North Carolina, is it a red state? I don't know. It's
because that's what's interesting me. I mean, would a state government be interested in doing that if it was California?
Probably not California, but I do think we're getting to a situation where what you might call the campus left is out of sync with the center left.
Okay.
Right? I think there are plenty of left-leaning people who nowadays are like, look, I've been a Democrat my whole life. I'm not really on board with how far to the left the Democratic Party is going, with how far to the left, in particular, campus politics is going. Yeah? Right. And so I do think center-left people are often sympathetic to these as a way of saying, we want that's why I said even just a centrist alternative, especially in the humanities and social sciences. Right. And I think the model for these schools is something like antitrust legislation, where you realize that, this needs to be broken up. There needs to be a healthy competition here. And if the overwhelming impetus is that, everyone within striking distance of Sydney is going to go to the University of Sydney if they can, the way to fix partisan bias, the way to fix ideological capture, is to require the University of Sydney to include a school within it where students can encounter conservative thought or even simply just center-left thought. You know?
Sure. Well, it would be a wonderful thing to think that might be possible in Australia too. I can't see it from where we're sitting right now, but in time, I mean, in a way, and Ben, I know we're running out of time, but in a way, that's what Ramsay was trying to do using private money. Not
right.
not
I was going to say, the analogue probably is the programs you set up.
Is the program, exactly. And as you know...
A school within a school.
A school within a school. Yeah. And at least initially, we encountered a howl of resentment, suspicion, resistance. But now they're running, and the courses have been running just fine for 3 or 4 years. And what you're saying about non-partisan courses is exactly the case. These are great books courses. Nobody could possibly accuse them of being politically angled one way or the other. So our hope has always been that by setting this example and leaving it in place so that it kind of gets into the bloodstream, it might become a model that other schools might adopt. But you're going a step further and saying that this could almost be a state policy.
Yeah,
legislated for the health of the community.
Yeah, so essentially what the legislature says is, you know, universities are receiving significant amounts of taxpayer dollars.
Yeah.
They should be accountable to what those taxpayers think is a good education.
Yep.
And this is part of the tension between Trump and Harvard at the moment. But it's already played out at the state level where, you know, a place like Texas, for example, Texas is an overwhelmingly conservative state.
Yep.
It's natural for taxpayers to say, look, we want our flagship university, UT Austin, to contain some representation of our perspective on the world. I don't think it is reasonable for universities to take huge amounts of funding from the government.
That's a good point to start at, because I mean, in Australia, for example, I think the figure is that something like $18 billion of Australian taxpayer money goes into the universities.
Yeah.
18 billion. And by the way, another 10 billion is international student payments.
Oh, wow.
We as a population, I think we have the largest international student population in our universities of any jurisdiction. It's enormous, especially from China. But that's a different point. But I think the point is that you're right. Taxpayers are just beginning to realize how expensive the universities are, how much money they're putting into them. And universities get all the income, but the taxpayer holds all the risk.
Yes, and also
that's the trouble.
And also the taxpayer, you know, like for example, I have an uncle who is lifelong Democrat, you know, and who very successful lawyer, and basically says, "I'm not going to hire anyone from the Ivy League ever again. They're too precious. They're too radical.
Entitled.
They're too entitled. They cause trouble." He said, "I don't know what's going on at places like Harvard and Yale, but they're just more trouble than they're worth." Right? And so I think your regular person out there has this imagination of what's going on at universities, that people are learning substantive things. And first they need to know that that's not actually what's going on. A lot of departments are essentially programs for proselytizing and propagandizing progressive radical activists.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
And so it is natural for the government to say, as the representative of the taxpayer interests, are you speaking to the people who are paying you? Is this what the people who are paying you would want you to be doing?
Yep.
And so I can imagine a bold enough set of politicians in Great Britain or in Australia making a similar change.
Well, look, here's something that I just wave this around and quote this whenever I'm on a platform, because it's just what you've said. So this is Edward Shills, right, at Chicago. This is like 30 years ago, already saying we are witnessing the acceptance of the notion that a person who regards his or her task as a university teacher to make propaganda for socialism or revolution among the students is entitled to the protection of academic freedom.
Yes.
That was 30 years ago that Shills was saying that. You know, he says teachers think the desirability of the destruction of existing society should be incorporated into the syllabuses which they prepare for their students. 1990s, and it's only got worse.
Yeah, so I think you raised this question of academic freedom.
Yeah.
I think we have a similar dilemma with the federal bureaucracy, and we have a similar dilemma with the military, which is the idea, like, if you have servants of the government, how much scope do they have to do what they're being asked to do, right? And so, for example, one of the reasons why the Western military is very effective tactically is because we allow officers a lot of scope in how they execute their mission. But we have this principle that they take their topmost orders from the civilian government. And in the same way, I think bureaucrats, like civil servants, and professors should take their topmost orders from the government that pays their bills, essentially from the people at large, right?
From the taxpayer.
Yeah, exactly. Now,
as represented by the government.
yeah, exactly. Part of it is because I think, like civil servants, academics are prone to professional deformation. If you spend your whole life studying Shakespeare, for example, you're going to be prone to think this is the absolute most important thing in the entire universe, and everyone should study it for several years of their life. And so you need some person above all that with a kind of general man in the street knowledge to say, no, look, we need this in our education, and we need that, and we need this, and we need to serve this purpose in our society. And it's not necessarily academics themselves who are best suited to doing that.
Indeed.
We're very blessed here at University of Austin to have very wise trustees coming in from other walks of life who can give an outside perspective and think about what kind of education do students really need, holistically considered, right? There's a place for that. Now, most academics are going to cry bloody murder about that.
They certainly are. They would in Australia. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. But I think we need academics to become more accustomed to this idea that they answer to the people. They answer to the wisdom of the people. That's how our society, you were talking about democracy and rule by the many rather than rule by the few. This is the big change in our time, is the rejection of technocracy, the rejection of expertise, specialized expertise in favor of the general wisdom of the people.
Yeah, I really hope so, Patrick. That would be great if that was the case. And I can sense a stronger current of opinion in that direction maybe in this country than in our country. But the metaphor that I always use, which is exactly what you're saying, is that universities have become kind of like icebergs that have broken off the mainland, and they're kind of drifting further and further away and further away. And because you're all on the iceberg busily doing your thing, you don't even realize how far you've got from where most people are.
Yes.
And I think that's exactly but I got pilloried for saying that.
Well, I think you're just right, and it doesn't mean that we're going to get deep in the weeds and tell people, you've got to teach exactly this way.
No.
You treat them like a military. I'm not going to tell a fighter pilot how to fly the plane, but I do think the fighter pilot should be answering to the government as to like whether you bomb Ukraine or not, right? So in the same way, when it comes to the general shape of the curriculum, like what subjects should every student study, that's a question for the population as a whole. That's a political question to be settled by the people, and then the execution of that is for credentialed, specialized experts.
Well, let me ask, I wanted to bring us back a little bit before we finish to where our institutions might be going. One of the things that's difficult about the United States is that it is so big. It might be difficult for us to see where do we go with this education renewal movement in the future. Now, Australia is smaller, but I want to ask you about what happened in the program that you set up at the University of Queensland as a way of looking at when you just put a good curriculum with good teaching practice and set relatively straightforward meritocratic benchmarks for
question.
entrance.
Yeah.
What happened?
A nice metric kind of answer. Normally I believe in what they call myotics rather than metrics, but in this case might be a bit different. So what happened is that we have a system in Australia for academic entry into universities called ATAR, which is a kind of academic, nationwide academic or statewide academic ranking. I think you have a similar thing with SATs. And so you can compare the academic standard that a student needs to have in order to get into a course, pretty much right across the country. And this can be done in humanities courses, and you can see which humanities courses have the highest ATAR scores required to get into them.
And just based on competition.
Based on competition
places,
at the end of high school and competition for places. And the single highest required ATAR for entry to any course in the humanities in the whole of Australia is the Ramsay course at the University of Queensland. And that's only been there for 3-4 years. So already the absolute best students are applying for this course and getting into this course. As a course, it has the highest quality students in the country in the humanities.
This goes
So
back to
that's-
the point that everyday people
notice.
know
Yeah.
what is good.
Yep.
And
Yes.
can choose it and will choose it.
And our
if
other
you
courses
provide.
also have very high ATAR scores and extremely high, what they call, I think, student satisfaction
Right.
reports, much higher than the average across the sector. So this is our hope, Ben, that over time the penny will drop, and ambitious young people will think this isn't just a kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Like a frippery, not just a kind of, way to pass you. It's really high quality, very demanding. You're going to be with very bright peers and colleagues. So
Yeah.
that's over
been-
time. Yeah.
The Ramsay Centers have been an inspiration to us here. I certainly had y'all in mind when I was designing our curriculum in the humanities.
Okay.
And I can say that the quality of students we're attracting is very, very high.
Yeah,
so
clearly,
I think we're headed in a similar direction.
Yeah, it's nice the way this goes round in a circle, because our model was partly, not only, but partly based on St. John's Annapolis, where your founding president was formerly
Correct, yeah.
president there too. So we kind of took it from there, and if it's come back to you, that's just great.
Okay,
That's just
sounds
great.
good.
Very good. All right, well, thanks for joining us, Dean
Hey.
Patrick Gray and Professor
Great
Simon
pleasure.
Haines.
Great pleasure.
Good
Thank
to
you.
be with you both.
Lovely
All
to be
right.
here.
Your chair's intact.
Oh man,
That
that was really something.